We're back to the Inside Scoop Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Hello and welcome to the Emerald Planet as we come to you on a week-to-week basis looking for those 1,000 best practices, technologies, services, and products that are making a difference as we move through the 21st century. And of course, we're looking for the leadership that is making the difference as we move towards 2050 and a planet which may have as many as 9 billion people. And so looking at that, how we're going to be able to protect the planet, try to reverse climate change, and at the same time provide livelihoods for 2 billion new people that will join the planet. We have someone that's actually working on this very idea and how we're going to be able to balance the environment as well as the economy and also social society development. Martin A. Keeley, who is the Global Education Director for Mangrove Action Project. He's coming in by Skype, and sitting right beside us, our good friend and almost becoming a regular on Emerald Planet TV, our special guest, Sudhir Shukla, who is the Outreach Specialist, Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, DC chapter. And welcome, glad to have you here with us. And Martin, welcome to the Emerald Planet TV. Okay, you're not coming through. Okay, let's get it. Let me say welcome again. Make sure you're coming through.
Okay.
There you are. Got a good voice. All right. Welcome. Thank you, Martin. Tell us a little bit about your organization's, this global education program that you're involved in for the Mangrove Action Project, and how that dovetails with the long-term mission and vision of your organization.
Well, Marvelous Mangroves, the concept of it was developed about 30 years ago. And the idea is to give children, particularly at the primary level and perhaps intermediate levels at the high school, an understanding of ecology, of mangrove ecology, how ecosystems work, and what our impact is on them.
Yeah, looking at that, you have something that's called marvelous mangroves. What is a marvelous mangrove? Because I thought they were all marvelous, but I guess some are better than others maybe. And how would you explain its origin and its use now in actually 13 different countries?
Mangroves have a lousy rep, don't they? And that's part of the problem, is that still they're considered nuisances and wastelands. It's a wetlands problem worldwide, no matter whether it's mangroves or freshwater wetlands. The idea is to work in different countries over an extended period of time, working through the education system and through the teaching system to be able to get kids to understand it and get kids down the road to be able to implement that knowledge when they move into positions of power, if you like.
Yeah, now looking at your logo here, I think this is very nicely done, and it really explains what a mangrove is just by the very image. But when you're trying to teach this to children, how they grow and the importance of them, how do they understand what a mangrove really is versus maybe something that's purely an on-land tree that has a very different root system and really has a different life cycle?
Good question, Sam. Well, the whole concept and the whole premise behind Marvelous Mangroves is to teach students through hands-on science and through exploration. There's enough pedagogy to float the planet, and nothing gets anywhere if you don't actually explore it in a physical manner, and a physical manner in a way to understand that how it functions. So obviously the first method you have to use is to understand that most trees die if you dump salt water on them. Mangroves don't. So how come they don't? So then you go through a whole process of exploring that, again through hands-on science, through field trip explorations.
Now looking at this image here, I believe you can see this, Martin.
Yep.
This is a very complex picture, but it really, I think, explains very well what you're doing in these seminars and on-site demonstrations. Go through this a little bit about what these children are actually seeing, what they're learning, and what they are actually absorbing that they can take back to their own families and also within the communities where they live.
Okay, this is a field trip that we always do at the end of an in-depth week-long, month-long, however long classroom process where we're actually doing activities in the classroom, experiments, if you like. What the kids are doing here is implementing that knowledge in the field. So they go into the field and they're exploring the different species of mangroves that they're seeing, and they're also with telescopes and binoculars, etc., looking at the different kinds of wildlife that you're going to find there, particularly species of birds, but other kinds of wildlife that you'll find in a mangrove, and they're identifying them. The whole concept is to understand why they're there and to identify their function within a mangrove ecosystem.
Yeah, and they're very complex ecosystems as well, because you have different kinds of insects and reptiles. I mean, it's just, there's everything in a mangrove, there's no doubt, plus lots of mosquitoes. Sadir?
Martin, so glad you could join us. What is the main purpose behind your program, and how does it differ from conventional educational programs on nature and marine ecosystems?
The problem with most, I hate to say the word problem, but anyway, the problem with most so-called education systems is they're very superficial. You might do a day trip and go explore a beach, or you might do a presentation in a classroom with a whole bunch of slides. But in essence, you're not really teaching anything, just touching it on a very, very superficial level. Concept behind Marvelous Mangroves is to get to the whole process in depth. So you're teaching students the function, but you're also teaching the relevance and the importance. And it's the old Confucius saying, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. So they are gaining an understanding of how ecosystems function.
Yeah, and looking at that, you can see just how intent and how inquisitive these young students are and the information that's being shared there. But looking at the Marvelous Mangroves, how are you able to introduce it into 13 and in some ways very different types of countries to have it accepted as part of maybe the STEM projects within those countries, but at the same time to really teach about nature and the environment?
We start at the bottom level, which is with either a local institution in that country or an NGO in that country, depending whichever organization you're going to work with, sometimes combining the two or three. And we have a working group of people that adapt. We have the English version has to be translated, first of all, into the language of the local country. Otherwise, what's the point? They're not going to use it. And it also has to be adapted for the specific ecosystems, the mangrove ecosystems in each country, the flora and fauna in each country. Because if it's not, again, it's not relevant to either the teachers or the students or the communities that live there. So you have to work through the school system. Sometimes it works really well. Sometimes it's a bit dodgy, because most I hate the word developing, but most countries where mangroves are found do not have the levels of sophistication that we have in the West. For example, I try to bring in 3-lens microscopes, just basic microscopes, light source microscopes, into each country and into each organization and group of teachers, etc., that I work with, because many of the children and many of the teachers in countries like Suriname, I was just in Suriname, haven't even seen a microscope. We take them for granted. But to understand and see the microscopic world, it opens up the whole planet to these people, especially the students.
Yeah, looking at the images that we have, but talking about some of the obstacles, we've been talking about how you go about the process of introducing this. What are some of the obstacles for this Marvelous Mangroves, which is really needed in these countries, that mangroves in many ways is a lifestay of the culture, of the society, of the environment, but also the local people as far as their economy?
Yeah, exactly. Well, there are some fundamental difficulties. One is that most education systems in many countries are not used to hands-on science. They're not used to this level of hands-on exploration. So you have to overcome that barrier. Once the teachers do overcome that barrier, you can't stop them. And when they take the stuff back to their kids in the classrooms and the schools, you can't stop them. The next difficult thing you have to get through is the bureaucracy, where there's an entrenched education bureaucracy in government, which is used to doing things the way it's always used to doing things. So you have to work with as many of the local education supervisors as possible and work through the system that way. One of the things we do is all the teacher workshops that we do when we introduce Marvelous Mangroves is the representative local education institutions are invited to come and take part in the process themselves so they understand it. So it's not just an imposition on them. They understand it, and then they begin to understand how they can implement it.
Yeah, I think it's very important just looking at this image here. I understand that having lived, worked, and traveled in 89 different countries, if you do not have the powers to be involved, then long term nothing's going to happen because it'll be just a short run, you know, one or one off or two off kind of activity. Sudhir?
Martin, what are some of the impacts you've seen of the Marvelous Mangroves project in the areas where you've introduced it?
Well, there's one I would like to use as an example. We've been looking at the Chinese, one group of Chinese students and teachers here. In a southern part of China, near a city called Zhangjiang, the local shrimp farmers were asked to sell their shrimp farms to the local mangrove organization to turn them back into mangroves. And there were several teachers who were on the local, I guess we'd call them councils, if you like, of the various communities that were voting to do this. And out of 6 communities, 4 of the communities voted to, yes, let's do it, and they've done it. They've reconverted shrimp farms into very successful mangroves ecosystems. The reason they were able to do it was because there were teachers who'd done the workshops and understood the value. They were able to convince the rest of the councils that, okay, let's go for it. So that's the way you can work within. And the same is true in Brazil. That's happened in a couple of locations in Brazil too.
Yeah, well, that's very important. And Martin, thank you for sharing that because that's a very valuable insight. Well, we run out of time. We have about 10 seconds. Where do you see a very in-depth teaching training program like the Marvelous Mangroves going over the next 5, 10, 15 years? You got to be quick.
Assuming we get the funding, we've got a lineup of about 25 different countries that want it. So we get the funding, that's going to spread across the
That's absolutely fantastic. So here, thank you for being with us. Martin, thank you for being with us. Martin Keeley, who is the Global Education Director for Mangroves. And thank you as we